But what they're looking for typically when they're looking at whether or not a chemical or an ingredient in some skincare product or what have you is harmful is they're looking for acute reactions. They're looking for rashes. They're looking for blistering. They're looking for things like hair loss.
Short-term stuff.
Short-term acute stuff. That is what their sort of checklist is of whether or not something would be considered harmful. And that's a giant net with giant holes all over it. We are
Correct.
not all the problems, right?
Yeah.
Some of the problems, but the problem with most of these toxicants is not acute exposures. Acute exposures are going to exist in an occupational setting. If you work in a factory, if you work in agriculture, if you're doing pesticide application, if you're working in any kind of manufacturing capacity, you are going to have elevated exposures. There's also, interestingly, para-occupational exposures, which are basically the spouses and family members of those people that are working in factories who come home with their clothes covered in dust or chemicals, and then they bring those chemicals home to their families. So the families of people working in occupational settings can also have more elevated exposures than somebody not working in that setting, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then the acute reactions, they're looking at isolated compounds or chemicals,
yes,
correct? Like they're not looking at, putting in 3 or 4 chemicals, let's say, into your shampoo or whatever it is.
Yes. They test in isolation, not formulation, is how I say it. So they're not testing your shampoo. And this is where we get into like the whole animal testing conversation, and that animal testing is not required. And companies that do animal testing, for example, like we know with rabbits and testing chemicals on their eyes because their eyes are closer to the way that our eyes are. Those are not required. They just do that for for legal reasons, to say like, hey, we tested it, didn't have any problems, so like it's fine.
But even animal testing has become, there's a lot of controversy around, many, and I'm not saying this is either the right thing or the wrong thing, but people will say, well, it's cruel. It's animal cruelty to take rabbits and test them and drop these things in their eyes.
Yes. I mean, I don't disagree with that. And, we don't necessarily have a better model. We don't have AI that's
right. And you probably can't do it on humans. You can't be like, hey, let's
can't test chemicals on humans because that we have just from a species perspective have decided that is unethical, which understandably it is. And so we have to test them on something. But, this idea again that our products have been tested for safety is that's just not real. It's not true. I mean, you can, like I said, you can go to the FDA's website. They clearly state, we don't regulate chemicals and we don't say that things are safe. And like we were just saying, is this idea of, when chemicals are tested, first of all, this is where we can get into that, whole toxicity conversation of who declares what is toxic, right? This is the field of toxicology does this. Is what they're looking for are these short-term acute exposures or effects. But they're also only testing things in isolation. So there exists, particularly within the realm of endocrine disrupting chemicals, and we can certainly go down that road. There exists something called the cocktail effect, which is the synergistic effect, where when scientists are testing multiple endocrine disruptors at the same time, they're finding that the effects are amplified. So it's not a 1 + 1 = 2, it's a 1 + 1 = 5 or 1 + 1 = 10. And so
every day on the daily for 40 years. Yeah.
That is not factored into this sort of conventional toxicology model of deciding whether or not something qualifies as being toxic. So, I think that word toxic is thrown around a lot, right? Whether we're using it sort of as this conceptual word of like toxic masculinity or some phrase like that, or like toxic relationships, right? So there's lots of iterations of this word. On the one hand, great application of that word. On the other hand, it really kind of strips the meaning out of the
It waters down the definition.
It waters down. Certainly, this is true also for the concept of detoxification, right?
Right. Tox and detox.
Yeah, it's really watered down. And so I think that, one of the things that I'm a really big advocate for is being as precise in your language as possible, right? I strive for being unambiguously clear, right?
Yeah.
This is what I mean. This is what I say. I don't mean this. I don't mean that. And really spelling that out for people, because it's so easy to get confused with this terminology. It's so easy, especially when you have companies that hang their hat on this marketing and they're like, oh, we've got this detox skin mask. That's not doing anything. That is not
or some laxative tea from some Instagram influencer. It's just
they're everywhere.
Honestly dehydrate you. And anyway.
Yeah.